Hello everyone, this is our report, Ansen China, Unit 5, and we are the reporter 3. So this is the reporter. Ambel Jennifer A, reporter 1, Caiña Grace C, reporter 2, and Manampan Muhajir T, reporter 3. Introduction. Ancient China was one of the most amazing civilizations in history. In the 5th century BCE, it was made up of several rival kingdoms. These were conquered by the king of the states of Qin, who became the first emperor in 221 BCE. The Chinese people became unified as one kingdom, which lasted for about 2,000 years. So this is our objectives. Differentiate ancient China from ancient India. Analyze the growth of Chinese empires and how it came to pass, and explain and identify the society and thought that paved the way to the growth of Chinese history. Differences between ancient China and ancient India. The reporter is Jennifer Ambel. Ancient China and ancient India are both important and interesting ancient civilizations. They are alike and unlike in many ways. Some significant ways in which ancient India and China are similar and different are religion, art, economics, politics, and social structure. Ancient China and ancient India both consider religion to be very important. The main religions of Chinese were Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. The central religions in India were Hinduism and Buddhism. Both ancient China and India had religious teachers that invented these prevalent religions. Confucius invented Confucianism, Lao Tzu invented Taoism, and Sun Tzu invented legalism in China. In India, Hinduism had its roots in the religious beliefs of the Aryan people. China was ruled by different dynasties, which means they were ruled by different families depending on the dynasty. India was mainly ruled by empires, where means the rulers were not always of the same bloodline. Rajas ruled in India. Rajas were princes or tribal chieftains. Meanwhile, China was ruled by emperors. Furthermore, the economy and both civilization was important to their survival. India and China population were made up of mainly farmers. Their main cash crops were milk and rice. India and China traded via the Silk Road. Because of the geography and different weather patterns of each ancient society, China grew crops that required little moisture, while India was not as restricted. India grew wheat and barley in addition to the milk and rice mentioned above. Ancient China and India imported and exported goods differently too. India traded by camel caravans and by sea. China mainly traded via the Silk Road. Ancient China and India both had social structures that basically dictated their ways of life. Two, they both had patriarchal societies. This meant that their societies were dominated by men. Family was extremely important in both culture. So this explanation is both similarities and differences between ancient China and ancient India.
And now, let us discuss the growth of Chinese empires. Ancient Chinese civilization refers to that period of China's history which began in the early 2nd millennium BCE, when a literate, city-based culture first emerged to the end of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE. By this time, all the essential foundation of Chinese civilization had been laid down. A timeline of ancient Chinese history. In 1766 BCE, traditional date for the founding of the first historic dynasty in China, which is the Shang Dynasty. In 1122 BCE, Western Zhou Dynasty, founded after the overthrow of the last Shang king. In 771 BCE, Eastern Zhou Dynasty period begins after the sack of the Western Zhou capital. The first phase is traditionally divided into two, which is the spring and autumn, and the Warring States periods. In 551 to 479 BCE, Confucius, China's preeminent philosopher, lives. In 221 BCE, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, completes the conquest of all other Chinese states. In 202 BCE, the Han Dynasty founded, after several years of chaos following the fall of Qin. In 220 CE, the fall of Han Dynasty is the convenient marker for the end point of ancient period of Chinese history. The location of ancient Chinese civilization. China is a vast country with a huge range of terrains and climates within it. Mountains, deserts, and coastal lands, and above all, the great river system of China, the Yellow River to the north, and the Yangtze to the south. All these have helped shape Chinese civilization. The Yellow River region. The civilization of ancient China first developed in the Yellow River region of northern China in 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. This is a very fertile region. However, the land needs irrigation to make the crops grow and well-built river embankments to prevent catastrophic flooding. In ancient times, the main crop in northern China was millet, a food still grown in many parts of the world as a major crop. This region is regarded as the cradle of China's civilization. It was here that the earliest Chinese dynasty were based. Throughout the ancient period of China's history, it formed the heart of Chinese world, and it was from here that Chinese civilization spread out across the rest of China. The Yangtze Valley region. To the south, the Great Yangtze Valley, with its warm, wet climate, was the first area in the world where rice was grown, sometime before 5000 BCE. Rice is one of the most nutritious plants in the world. From this region, rice cultivation spread far and wide across southern China and into Southeast Asia. For much of ancient times, the Yangtze region remained outside the Chinese culture area. However, about 700 BCE, the kingdoms and peoples here began to be gradually absorbed into Chinese world. The South. The Chinese only expanded into the mountains and coastal of southern China and later the ancient period, after the rest of China had been unified under the rule of emperors. It remained a largely frontier region until the later centuries. The steppes of Central Asia. To the north and west of Yellow River region are the wide plains of Central Asia. This landscape here is generally unsuitable for farming, and the people have mostly followed a nomadic way of life as herders of cattle, sheep, and horses. The modern scholar believed that various cultural influence traveled along this route in ancient times to help shape China's civilization. For example, skills in working with metals and, in particular, making bronze objects seem to have came to China from Middle East across Central Asia. Later, the chariot also apparently arrived in China from same direction. The peoples of the steppe were taught warriors, and the mobility that their nomadic lifestyle gave them enabled them to raid swiftly into territory populated by more settled farming populations. They were a regular scourge to the Chinese ancient times as well as later. The origins of ancient China. Legend. The Shai dynasty is the first dynasty in China to be described in ancient historical chronicles. The records of grand historian and classical of rites say that the Yu the Great, the founder of Shai dynasty, was the grandson of Wang Zu, one of the legendary 5 emperors who were the first rulers of China. In those 5 emperors, were the Yellow Emperor, Wangzu, Emperor Ku, Emperor Yao, and Shan. The Yellow Emperor, also known as Huang Di, supposedly ruled for even 100 years from 2697 to 2597 BCE. He is considered the originator of Chinese civilization. Yu was successful in stopping devastating floods and increasing the yields from farming, and the Shai tribes' influence strengthened. He was made the leader of surrounding tribes, and soon afterwards was sent with an army to suppress a tribe which was causing trouble on the kingdom's borders. He won a victory which further strengthened his power. Shan, the last of the five emperors, was getting old, and abdicated the throne in the favor of Yu, whom he deemed worthy. Yu's succession as the king marked the start of the Shai dynasty. Shortly before his death, instead of passing power to the person deemed most capable to rule, Yu passed power to his son, setting the precedence for dynastic rule. The archaeological evidence. Prior to the coming of cities and literacy, major Stone Age farming cultures had been growing up in China since 7th millennium BCE. One was located in the Yellow River region and the other in the Yangtze region. The archaeologists found tortoise shells and animals' bones writing on them. One of these is the oracle bones. Oracle bones are part of animal bone used in divination ceremonies in ancient China. Yellow River region. The Yellow River region was the setting for the emergence of Chinese civilization into the light of history. By c. 4000 BCE, walled and moated towns had appeared. They continued to grow in size. What looks very much like primitive Chinese characters had also appeared inscribed on pottery. These characters became more complex as time went by. Other technical advances included the introduction of the potter's wheel and the production of the high-quality jade ornaments. Finds of luxury grave goods and the remains of large and complex buildings shows that a wealthy ruling elite stood out from the population at large. Metallurgy. Metallurgy reached China sometime around 2500 BCE, almost certainly from the Middle East via Central Asia. At first, this was restricted to copper work, but by c. 1800 BCE, knowledge of bronze casting had entered the Yellow River Valley. At around the same time, there was a dramatic increase in the size and density of some walled settlements in that region. These are the earliest known cities in East Asia. The region had in fact seen appearance of fully urban, literate, Bronze Age civilization, and ancient China finally emerged into the full light of history with the first of its historic dynasties, the Shang.
Historical overview of ancient China. Most of the history of Chinese civilization, including the ancient period, has traditionally been divided into dynasty. So I will be tackling that later on. So lines of kings or emperors from a single family, following each other on their throne from generation to generation. So a succession of sovereigns of a country belonging to a single family, or tracing their descent to a common ancestor. So during much of the ancient period, what would later be known as a Chinese civilization was only gradually spreading across the area which today we know as China. Thus, the early dynastic rulers of China are known as kings rather than emperors. It is only after the time of the first emperor who reigned over a united China from 221 BCE, that the imperial period of the Chinese history began, the early dynasties of the ancient China. So China was ruled by an emperor for over 2,000 years. So the first emperor was Qin Shi Huang, who took the title in 221 BC after he united all of the China under one rule. Archaeologists have uncovered urban sites, bronze implements, and tombs that point to the possible existence of the semi-legendary Xia dynasty at locations cited in ancient Chinese historical texts. In 1959, a site located in the city of Yanxi was excavated containing large palaces with some archaeologists have identified as the capital of Xia dynasty. So there is some disagreement over whether Erlito culture was the birthplace of the Xia dynasty. So the site was dated between 2100 and 1800 BC by radiocarbon dating, indicating the existence of a state contemporaneous with possible equivalent to the Xia dynasty document in Chinese text. So unlike the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty, there are no written records from the period to help confirm the Xia dynasty's existence. So, through the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists have continued to uncover urban sites, bronze implements, and tombs at locations linked to the Xia in ancient Chinese historical texts. At the minimum, the Xia dynasty seems to have marked an evolutionary stage between the late Neolithic culture and the late Chinese urban civilization of the Shang dynasty. So Shang dynasty come to an end around 1046 BC. The final king's Shang lineage, King Di Xin, leading the calls for the end of his rule. So the Zhou army led by King Wu marched on the capital city. Di Xin 200,000 slaves defeated to the Zhou armies. Some Shang army refused and even some joining to the other side. The Shang dynasty period saw further strides in material cultures, and some of the finest bronze in the world history were produced by Chinese craftsmen of the period. In due course, the Shang dynasty was succeeded by a new line of kings, the Zhou dynasty. Under the early Zhou or Western Zhou, the cultural and political reach of ancient Chinese civilization expanded enormously. This, however, eventually resulted in fragmentation amongst numerous territorial princes. The authority of the Zhou kings declined, and the princes effectively independent ruler. The later Zhou or Eastern Zhou dynasty period was characterized by constant warfare between increasingly large and powerful regional states. It was also a time when important innovation began to emerge, which were the characterized Chinese civilization down to the 20th century. It was the time that the great philosophies which would shape the Chinese world. So by the end of the 5th century, the feudal system was consolidated into 7 prominent and power states, which is the Han, Wei, Zhao, Yu, Chu, Qi, and Qin. Confucianism emerged, and it was also the period to which root of that distinctly Chinese style of bureaucratic government can be traced. So Confucius, who lived during the 16th century BCE, was one of the most foremost Chinese philosophers. Confucius was pragmatic and sought to reform the existing government, encouraging a system of mutual duty between superiors and inferiors. From the Han Dynasty in 202 BCE through the end of the dynasty authority in 1911, Confucianism was widely practiced in China. The Imperial Dynasty of Ancient China. The final phase of ancient China's history was characterized by the rise of strong, centralized states, which unified the Chinese people under a single imperial dynasty. The Qin dynasty emerged when one of the states into which China was divided conquered all the others and unified China under its rule. Its king took the title Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. So when the Qin state emerged victorious from the warring state period in 221 BCE, the state leader King Xing claimed the mandate of heaven and established the Qin dynasty. He renamed himself to Shi Huangdi, that today is known as Qin Shi Huang. The Qin dynasty is famous for imposing a rigid unity on Chinese society and building an early version of the Great Wall of China. Qin regime's very rigidity, however, made it a short-lived dynasty. The Qin regime's very rigidity, however, made it a short-lived dynasty. It was brought down by regional forces, which it had failed to tame, and by a peasantry, which it had ruthlessly exploited. So Qin dynasty is one of the shortest in all Chinese history, lasting only about 15 years. But also Qin dynasty was one of the most important. Qin Shi Huang permitted the Chinese to think of themselves as citizens of unified kingdom by standardizing society and uniting the state into the first Chinese empire. So under Qin Shi Huang began the building of the Great Wall of China, one of the greatest construction feats of all the time to protect the nation against barbarian. The Han Dynasty. The next of this unifying dynasty, however, would rule China for some 400 years. This was the Han Dynasty, arguably the most important of all the China's dynasties. So Gaozu, who had been born a peasant, founded the Han Dynasty in 202 BCE, unifying China. The Han Dynasty became one of the most important and long-lasting dynasties in all the Chinese history. It would rule China for over 400 years, from 206 BCE to 220 BCE, and ushered in a golden age of peace, prosperity, and development. So today, both of the majority ethnic group in China and Chinese script are called Han. Under the Han emperors, the Chinese become so used to being ruled as a single nation that to these days, they call themselves the Han people. It was under the Han that Confucianism triumphed to become the ruling ideology of China. At the same time, an empire-wide bureaucracy staffed to a large extent by officials recruited and promoted on merit and imbued with Confucian thought came to govern China. Even the examination system for recruiting officials, which would came to play such an important role in Chinese life, can trace its root back to this period. So under Han emperors, Emperor Wu established significant government industries, transportation and delivery service, profit management by the government, and a 5% income tax. Emperor Wu created civil service examination to test potential government officials and their knowledge of the Confucian classics, so that bureaucrats would be chosen for their intelligence, instead to their social connections. The end of ancient China. The Han Dynasty lasted until 220 CE, when it broke up into several successor states. Thus began a period of weakness for China, when no single dynasty was able to establish its rule over the whole country for several centuries. This opened the way for non-Chinese people from surrounding regions to establish their own states within China. This was a dark period in Chinese history, but by no means as dark as the period which followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in Europe. Society was disrupted, trade declined, and many cities shrunk. But even in barbarian-occupied areas, administration staffed by Confucian-educated officials continued to govern. Chinese civilization was preserved intact until a few centuries later. New dynasties would once again rule the whole China. So when the Han Dynasty collapsed in 220 CE, no one was powerful enough to unify China under a single emperor. So the result was the period of the three kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu, battled for control in a long series wars. This was one of the bloodiest times in Chinese history, and according to the census, the population decreased from 50 million to 16 million.
Okay, so let's proceed to the civilization of ancient China. The state, the Confucian bureaucratic state which governed China for more than 2,000 years of history, first involved in ancient China. All of the key governing institutions of Imperial China came into being at this time. Confucian bureaucratic state governed China for more than 2,000 years, and all of the key governing institutions of Imperial China came into being at this time. The Emperor, China's pre-20th century state, was associated above all else with the rule by emperors, monarchs who ruled the whole of China and often neighboring regions as well. They belonged to different dynasties, lines of rulers who followed each other on the throne from generation to generation. China's history is traditionally divided into such dynasties, and this was just as true of ancient China as later periods, as we see in the historical summary above. As we noted, the early rulers of Shang and Zhou dynasties styled themselves as a king from the late 3rd century BCE. However, the monarchs of the Qin and Han dynasties ruled over a united China, and as a result, they styled themselves emperors. And these they were followed by rulers of China until the end of the last imperial dynasty in the early 20th century CE. China pre-20th century state ruled by emperors and followed each other on the throne from generation to generation. China's history is traditionally divided into such dynasties, and the Shang and Zhou dynasties styled themselves as a king. And however, the monarchs of Qin and Han dynasty ruled over a united state, and as a result, they styled themselves as emperors. And in this they were followed by rulers of China until the end of the last imperial dynasty in the early 20th century CE. The mandate of heaven. Chinese rulers bore the title Son of Heaven. They claimed to be heaven's representative on earth. Emperors were viewed as sacred figures. To disobey them is to disobey heaven. The concept of the Son of Heaven was closely linked to the idea, very influential in Chinese history, of the mandate of heaven. By this, a dynasty received divine authority to rule. However, it was believed that if emperors ruled badly or unjustly, their dynasty was liable to lose this mandate. And these circumstances, it was legitimate for rebels' attempt to replace the dynasty with a new one. which had shown that it now enjoyed the heavens' favor. Chinese rulers bore the title Son of Heaven, and it has sacred figures. To disobey them was to disobey heaven. A concept of the Son of Heaven influential in Chinese history. A dynasty received divine authority to rule, but it was believed that if emperors ruled badly or unjustly, their dynasty was liable to lose this mandate. And it rebels attempt to replace the dynasty with a new one, and had shown that it now enjoyed the heavens' favor. The court. Emperors were surrounded by courts. This consisted of the royal family and its attendants, as well as ministers and officials responsible for helping the emperor in governing the huge country. The court was housed in the royal palace located in the capital. It was the political center of the state, and what went there ultimately affected the entire empire. In particular, the decline of dynasty. The Han Dynasty is a very clear example, can often be traced to two events at court. The emperors were surrounded by courts, and then the court is helping the emperor in governing the huge country. The civil service. The ancient period of China's history saw the emergence of one of the most impressive governing institutions in world history, the Chinese civil service. This astonishing organization predates Western civil service by some 2,000 years. The civil service is one of the most impressive governing institutions in world history. The roots of Chinese bureaucracy go back to the later Zhou dynasty, when the territorial princes were centralizing the government of their states. It came to maturity under the Han dynasty. During Han times, the civil service became a huge organization, employing many thousands of officials. It was responsible for keeping law and order, collecting taxes, maintaining irrigation systems and flood defenses, and a host of undertasks to do with keeping China governed effectively. More remarkable still, the Han Dynasty inaugurated a revolutionary new system of recruiting public officials by examining candidates for public posts. The examination system was established one of the most revered institutions in Chinese history. The defense. Ancient China saw the transformation of armed forces from feudal forces based around aristocratic warriors in Shang and early Zhou times to mass armies composed largely of infantry troops. In the late Zhou, Qin, and Han periods, these armies were made up of different kinds of recruits. Long service, professional soldiers, peasant conscripts, and non-Chinese tribesmen. The Great Wall of China. The defenses of China never relied solely on military manpower. However, in the 5th and 4th century BCE, the northern and western border states most exposed to raids by steppe nomads had begun to build long walls made of beaten earth to help keep these raids out. After the unification of China under the Qin, the new imperial regime merged this wall into a single system of defense. These walls were the ancestors of the famous Great Wall of China, refurbished into present form under the Ming Dynasty in the 5th century CE. So one of the defense of China is the Great Wall of China. And next, economy and society in ancient China. Population. During the ancient period, the Han spread through settlement and the assimilation of indigenous peoples across northern China and down into the Yangtze region. This process is covered in the article Society in Ancient China. Population censuses began being taken during the Han Empire, which record a population of about 50 or 60 million. This makes it, along with the Roman Empire, the largest state in the ancient world. Even by the end of the Han Dynasty, the heart of Chinese civilization lay in the Yellow River region of northern China. It was here that the two capital cities, first Chang'an and then Luoyang, were located. The Yangtze region, and even more the far south and southwest, remained underpopulated frontier regions inhabited largely by non-Chinese peoples. While the great majority of people remained engaged in agriculture and lived in farming villages, the ancient period saw towns and cities spread across China. Most of these were administrative centers, where provincial officials were based along with their staffs. Many were tiny by modern standards. The Han censuses show only 12 cities of more than 50,000 inhabitants. Most of the rest would have been far smaller. Nevertheless, the capital of Han China was always among the largest cities in the world, at times the largest. Chang'an, the capital of the early Han emperors, had 250,000 inhabitants, and the later Han capital, Luoyang, 500,000. So this is the explanation of the population in ancient China. Next, farming and farmers. Ancient China's economy and society was based on agriculture. The vast majority of Chinese families live in small farming villages, dotted across intensively cultivated landscape. Chinese agriculture possessed, from ancient times, its own characteristics. Almost everywhere, it was dependent on the careful and unremitting management of water, to irrigate the fields of millet in North China, keep back the river floods near the great rivers, and swamp the paddy fields of southern China. Their social position and economic condition of farmers has been different at different times. In early times under the Shang and early Zhou, they were serfs, semi-servile bandsmen tied to their particular lords. From Middle Zhou times, as the old feudal aristocracy disappeared, more and more of them became free owners of their small farms. Later again, in later Han times, their status declined again. Whatever the farmers' condition as the centuries went by Chinese, agriculture became more and more productive. New crops and the spread of iron tools and new techniques led to more intensive farming. From later Zhou times, government became active in promoting agriculture, especially by bringing new land under irrigation. These various factors result in population growth. Next, trade and industry in Imperial China. As agriculture became more productive and population increased, trade and industry also grew. The introduction of coinage in later Zhou times facilitated trade, and technological innovations such as the development of steel making contribute to industrial expansion. Another major factor was state intervention. Under the Qin and Han, the standardization in such things as weights and measures and road building would have had a major impact. International trade first gained prominence under the Han Dynasty. By gaining control over the eastern steppes of Central Asia, the Han enabled the Silk Road, that great trade routes across Asia to the Middle East and Europe, to become established. At the same time, the conquest of South China opened up the maritime trade to Southeast Asia, although the South remained an underpopulated frontier zone in ancient times. A few important ports were established on the coast. It was in this period that Canton began its long story as a center of international commerce. The merchants and craftsmen in Chinese society. Craftsmen must have formed a privileged class in early China. Their products, including some of the finest bronze ever produced, must have been highly valued by the ruling elite in Shang and early Zhou times, and this must have conferred a certain status on their makers. In Middle and later Zhou, times merchants becomes more influential as a class, and the economic expansion under the Han Dynasty especially benefited the urban classes. Government policies designed to keep merchants in their place could not halt them from growing in numbers and wealth. The ruling classes. The societies of early China under the Shang and early Zhou dynasties were dominated by an hereditary feudal aristocracy. Later, however, the position of this group declined and a new social class emerged, that of the gentry, small landowners who provide rulers with their growing number of officials. By the time of the Qin and Han dynasties, a career in government was effectively open only to members of the gentry class. By mid-Han times, however, a new super elite of great landowners was emerging, its members enriched by holding high office. This new class will dominate Chinese society and politics and in the centuries that follow. This time, the Shang and Zhou dynasty dominated by an hereditary feudal aristocracy. And later, the position of this group is declined. So, the Qin and Han dynasty, small landowners who provide rulers with their growing numbers of officials by the time of Qin and Han dynasty. So, yun yung pagkakaiba. The family. In pre-modern China, modern China, the family was of the almost sacred significance and attitude, giving rise to and reinforced by the practice of ancestor veneration. The existence of ancestor veneration is attested in the earliest texts from ancient China, the Shang dynasty oracles, and throughout China's long history, the rise and decline of higher religions and modes of thought, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on, never undermine the practice which might with some justification be thought of as the basic sacred tradition of China. Women had a subordinate place in the Chinese family from ancient times. Their duty was to obey first their father, then their husbands, and then, after their husband's death, their eldest son. This should not be exaggerated. However, children of both sexes were taught to obey and respect. So that is the culture of the family of the ancient China. Then let's proceed to the culture in China. Ancient beliefs and practices. It seems clear that many of traditional Chinese religion and philosophical ideas and practices were already present when written records began and probably for long before. Such elements as divination, ancestor veneration, Feng Shui, the Tao, and the supreme god Di are all evidence in the Shang oracle bones inscriptions. Zhou schools of thought. It was in mid and late Zhou periods, however, that the school of thought developed, which were so profoundly to influence Chinese thinking down to the 20th century. Four of these stand out as by far the most influential. Confucianism. This thought that people must accept their place in society if society is to be harmonious. However, social relationships should be reciprocal. Thus, while a son should obey his father and father should act considerately towards the son. So this is the rule of Confucianism. Taoism. The Taoist belief that a person must live in accordance with the flow of nature. Trying to change the way things are is futile. So Muhajir, the philosopher Mozi, believed that anything that helped people's welfare and contribute to peace was good, anything that did not was bad. People should practice universal love and not live selfishly. So this is the explanation of Muhajir. Legalism. The legalists say that the most important thing was that the state should be strong. To achieve this, All people should obey the ruler and his official without question. For his part, the ruler should do whatever it takes to strengthen the state, whether it is immoral or not. Throughout China's long history, these philosophical stances have never been mutually exclusive. Many educated Chinese have been Confucians in public life, Taoists in the privacy of their own homes, and when serving in an official post have happily pursued legalist policies. The different philosophies have also deeply influenced each other so that, for example, the dominant of the three, Confucianism, has had strong Taoist and legalist elements within it. At first thought, these four schools seem to have regarded themselves as exclusive rivals for people's allegiances. The Qin dynasty came to power through the application of legalist principles and sought to eliminate all other schools of thought. After that dynasty fell, however, the Han dynasty enshrined Confucianism as the official ideology of the state. As such, it was probably forced to make in ideas from other schools, particularly legalism and Taoism, in order to remain relevant to the needs of government and official. In late Han times and after Taoism and even more Buddhism came to prominence, Buddhism was the first belief system from outside China to have a widespread impact on the Chinese people. Literature. Apart from works on divination and religious rites, literature in ancient China really got going in mid-Zhou times, the time of Confucius and other philosophers. A number of works dating to Zhou and Han times gained the status of classics and came to be viewed almost as religious texts. They embodied the foundation of Confucian thought and would have a profound influence on Chinese civilization. Works of history. The other major strand of Chinese prose literature was history. The Han historian Sima Qian set the standard of history writing the next 2,000 years. Henceforth, history will be a major feature of Chinese literature. The poetry. So far as poetry was concerned, here again, the Han period set in place foundations which will be followed and elaborated upon for hundreds of years. Two stanzas become popular. The first, Shi, consistent of short poems written in a compact, spare style. The second, Fu, consistent of longer, more ornate verses. The interaction between these two styles would give a particular character to Chinese verse, reflecting a varying mix of the discipline of Shi with the expressiveness of Fu. The art. Apart from the beautiful bronzes dating to the Shang and early Zhou times, few works of art have come down to us from ancient China. Nevertheless, wonderful small clay models of houses, horses, and people designed to be placed engraved show that Han artists strove for realism as well as lively movement. Also, writings from the Han period mention lively paintings adorning the walls of fine houses. So this is the report of Reporter 3, the ancient China. The reporter is Ambel Jennifer A, Caiña Gracie, and Manampan Muhajir T. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.